"My son ordered me to wake up at 5 in the morning tomorrow to make coffee for my daughter-in-law," he said, "because, as the mother-in-law, it's my obligation." But last night, while he was asleep, I set his alarm for 4 in the morning and prepared a surprise they'll never see coming. It's been 6 months since Terrence and Tiffany came to live in my house after they lost their apartment because they couldn't afford the rent. My son had lost his job at a commercial roofing company where he was making about $600 a week, and Tiffany had to close her nail salon because the debts piled up to $8,000. They arrived with 2 huge suitcases and a shoebox full of unpaid bills, promising it would only be temporary until they could get back on their feet financially. Welcome to my Voices of Auntie May. I share new life stories here every day, and I'd really appreciate it if you hit subscribe and liked my video. Now, let's jump back into my story. I'm sure you'll love it if you keep listening till the end. At first, everything seemed normal. I cooked their favorite meals, I cleaned their rooms, and I helped them out, just like any mother would for her struggling child. Terrence seemed grateful, and Tiffany even helped me wash the dishes after dinner. I even started to think it was nice having company in this house, which had been so empty since my husband Marcus passed away 3 years ago. But little by little, Terrence started to change. First, they were small orders disguised as kind requests. He'd ask me to do their laundry because Tiffany was too tired from looking for work all day. Then he asked me to cook only his favorite comfort foods because he needed to feel better emotionally to face job interviews. Next, he asked me to clean their room every single day because Tiffany was apparently allergic to dust. Things got strange when Terrence started talking to me like I was his personal employee. He no longer said please or thank you when I served his food. His orders came out dry and direct during dinner, while Tiffany nodded along as if everything was completely normal. He'd tell me I had to wash his clothes with a special softener that cost $2 a bottle. He demanded I cook specific cuts of meat that cost $25 a pound. He ordered me to clean the entire house every day just in case his friends decided to visit. And like a fool, I obeyed everything, truly believing it was my duty to help my son until he got back on track. Last month, Terrence found a new job at an insurance company where he makes $400 a week. Tiffany also found a part-time job at a local hair studio, making $200 a week. Between the two of them, they have an income of $600 per week, enough to rent a small apartment and start over. But they haven't left my house. In fact, their behavior toward me has gotten worse. Last night was the final straw. After dinner, roast chicken that I had cooked with my own hands and paid for with my Social Security check of $1,000 a month, Terrence stood up from the table, looked me straight in the eye, and told me with a coldness that froze my blood that tomorrow I had to wake up at 5 in the morning to prepare milk and coffee for Tiffany in bed, along with French toast and fresh fruit. He said she was used to an early breakfast, and since I was the mother-in-law, it was my obligation. Tiffany smiled from her chair, caressing her dyed blonde hair, which she gets touched up every 2 weeks at the salon where she works. As if she had just received the greatest gift in the world. She didn't say a single word to defend me or to suggest that a 71-year-old woman didn't need to get up before dawn to serve her breakfast. She simply savored the moment while my own son turned me into his personal maid. I stood by the table with the dirty dishes in my trembling hands, feeling like 45 years of sacrifice and unconditional love were crumbling in a single second. For decades, I worked double shifts at the packaging plant, getting up at 5 in the morning and returning home at 9 at night to pay for Terrence's vocational program, which cost $10,000. I sold the gold jewelry my husband Marcus gave me on our wedding anniversary to buy him his first motorcycle for $3,500. I mortgaged this house, which I'd paid off with 20 years of honest work, to loan him $15,000 when he wanted to start his own engine repair business, which later went bankrupt due to his irresponsibility and lack of commitment. And now he was standing there, in my own house, in the living room where he grew up playing with his toy cars, ordering me to become his wife's free domestic worker. I couldn't sleep that night. I stayed awake until 3 in the morning, thinking about every moment that led me here. I remembered when Terrence was 8 and got pneumonia. how I spent all my $600 in savings on medicine and private doctor visits because the care at County General Hospital was too slow. I remembered when he turned 18 and told me that when he grew up, he would take care of me and give me everything I deserved for being the best mother in the world. I remembered when he married Tiffany 5 years ago and promised in his speech in front of all the guests that he would always honor and respect his mother because everything he had, he owed to me. All those promises now seemed like cruel lies designed to manipulate my mother's heart. At 3:30 in the morning, I made a decision that would change everything forever. I got out of bed, walked silently down the hallway where photos of Terrence from babyhood to his graduation were hung, and entered his room without a sound. Terrence was sleeping deeply with that heavy breathing he always had since he was a child having nightmares. I took his phone from the nightstand, set his alarm for 4 in the morning, and wrote a note that read, "Time to make coffee for your wife, like a real husband." But that wasn't all. I went back to my room and pulled out an old notebook from my dresser where I had meticulously recorded every expense I had incurred for him over the last 20 years. Every loan, every favor, every dollar I spent saving him from his financial problems and irresponsibilities. The total was $75,000 that he had never returned or even mentioned. Tomorrow, Terrence is going to wake up at 4 in the morning and understand that I am no longer his personal employee. He will wake up and find a detailed bill for everything I have given him during his adult life. And then, he will receive the surprise I've been secretly preparing these last few weeks. A surprise that will change the rules of this game forever because I've decided that I will not be anyone's doormat, not even my own son who shares my last name. When Terrence was 5 years old and got bronchitis, I sold my white gold engagement ring for $200 to pay for the medicine that insurance didn't cover. That was the first of countless times I sacrificed something of mine to give him everything. Now, as I wait for his alarm to ring at 4 in the morning, I realize that every single one of those sacrifices brought me to this moment of humiliation in my own home. Marcus and I bought this house in 1985 when it cost $45,000, and we paid it off in 20 years with enormous sacrifices. He worked in construction, making $800 a week, and I worked at the textile mill, making $600. We were living on about $1,400 a month, paying the $600 a month mortgage and surviving on the rest. When Terrence was born in 1987, we converted the tool shed into his bedroom, painting it green because we didn't have money for wallpaper. The first few years were the hardest. Terrence was a sickly baby who constantly caught colds. Doctor visits cost $75 each, and medicines sometimes cost up to $100 a month. Marcus worked extra shifts on weekends to earn extra money, and I stopped buying new clothes for 3 years so I could pay for everything Terrence needed. When Terrence turned 10, Marcus had an accident at the site and was out of work for 4 months. I worked double shifts at the factory from 5 in the morning until 10 at night, making $400 a week. Terrence was left alone at home after school, and when I got home at 11 at night, I always found him asleep on the sofa waiting for me. I would leave dinner prepared in the refrigerator with a note telling him how much I loved him. During those 4 months, I sold the pearl earrings Marcus gave me on our first anniversary, my father's watch that I had inherited when he died, and even the porcelain dinnerware that had belonged to my grandmother. Everything to keep the house running and make sure Terrence didn't feel like he was missing anything. I never told him we were having financial problems because I wanted to protect his childhood. When Terrence reached adolescence, things got more expensive. He needed new clothes every 6 months because he was growing fast, and the athletic sneakers he wanted cost $120 a pair. His schoolmates had video games and new bikes, and Terrence would come home asking me why he couldn't have the same things. Marcus and I decided our son wasn't going to feel inferior to anyone. We worked extra shifts for a full year to buy him the $500 mountain bike, the $400 video game console, and the name brand clothes his friends wore. I stopped going to the hair studio and started cutting my own hair to save the $60 a month I spent on my personal upkeep. At 17, Terrence wanted to study automotive mechanics at a private vocational institute because he said the public schools didn't have good programs. The tuition cost $10,000 annually for 2 years. Marcus and I didn't have those savings, so we mortgaged the house, which we had already finished paying off, for the second time to get the money. We signed papers that committed us to paying $400 a month for 15 years. Terrence studied mechanics for 2 years, but he never graduated because in the last semester he decided he didn't like getting his hands dirty with motor oil. He dropped out of school 3 months before finishing, and the $20,000 we had paid was completely lost. When I asked him why he hadn't finished, he told me he had changed his mind and now wanted to work in sales because it was easier and he could earn more money. At 20, Terrence got a job at a local used car lot where he earned $300 a week plus commission. He fell in love with a Honda motorcycle that cost $3,500 and asked me to lend him the money because the bank wouldn't give him credit since he had no credit history. Marcus had already died of a heart attack the year before, and I was living alone on my widow's pension of $1,000 a month. I sold the gold jewelry Marcus had given me during our 25 years of marriage, the wedding earrings, the bracelet from our 10th anniversary, and the necklace he gave me when Terrence was born. In total, I got $2,800. I gave the $2,500 to Terrence for his motorcycle and kept $300 for personal expenses. Terrence promised to pay me $50 a month until the debt was paid off, but after 6 months, he stopped giving me money, claiming he had too many expenses and would pay me back when he had a better job. He never returned a single penny of that loan. At 23, Terrence met Tiffany at a nightclub and fell madly in love. Tiffany worked as a manicurist at a cheap salon and made $200 a week. Terrence wanted to impress her by taking her to expensive restaurants and buying her costly gifts that he couldn't afford on his salary. He started asking me for loans every 2 weeks. $50 for a romantic dinner, $80 for perfume, $40 for a dress Tiffany wanted. During the first year of their courtship, Terrence borrowed more than $3,500 from me for his dates with Tiffany. I gave it to him because I thought I was helping my son be happy and build a solid relationship. I never imagined I was financing an irresponsible man who didn't understand the value of money or honest work. When Terrence decided to marry Tiffany, he asked me to help with the wedding because her parents didn't have the financial resources. The celebration they wanted cost $15,000. The banquet hall, the food for 100 guests, the wedding dress, the groom's suit, the flowers, the music, and the cake. I had $8,000 saved from my pension over 3 years, but it wasn't enough. I mortgaged my house for a third time to get the remaining $7,000. I signed papers that committed me to paying $400 a month for 20 years, money that represented more than half of my monthly pension. But I wanted Terrence to have the wedding of his dreams and start his marriage in the best possible way. The wedding was beautiful. Terrence looked very sharp in his $700 black suit, and Tiffany looked like a princess in her $2,500 white dress. During his speech, Terrence publicly thanked me in front of all the guests, saying that everything he had in life he owed to his mother, that I was the most generous and self-sacrificing woman in the world, and that he would always care for and protect me. All the guests applauded emotionally, and I cried tears of joy, thinking my son had finally understood the value of everything I had done for him throughout his life. 5 years later, Terrence is standing in my kitchen, ordering me to wake up at 5 in the morning to serve his wife breakfast in bed, as if I were his personal domestic employee. All those sacrifices, all those sleepless nights working to give him the best, all those moments when I put his needs before mine, brought me to this point where my own son treats me as if I were invisible, as if everything I did for him never happened. But this morning, everything is going to change because I'm not the same woman who sold her jewelry to buy him toys anymore. I'm no longer the mother who sacrificed in silence, waiting for gratitude that never arrived. After Terrence ordered me to prepare Tiffany's breakfast in bed, I started to notice strange small details in their behavior that made me realize my suspicions about their true intentions were correct. This morning, When his alarm went off at 4, I heard him cursing and yelling from his room, wondering who had changed the time. But the most disturbing thing happened after breakfast. Terrence came down to the kitchen at 6:30 with a look of fury I hadn't seen since he was a teenager. His eyes were red from lack of sleep, and his hair was messy. But what caught my attention the most was the way he looked at me when he saw me preparing my own coffee in my own kitchen. He didn't say good morning or ask me how I had slept. He simply stood in front of me with his arms crossed and asked me in an icy tone if I was the one who changed his alarm. I lied. I told him I didn't know anything about his alarm and that maybe his phone had a technical problem. Terrence studied me with a suspicious look for several seconds, as if he was trying to read my thoughts. Then he moved closer to me and said something that chilled my blood, that from now on, I was forbidden to enter his room without permission, and that if I ever touched his personal belongings again, he would punish me like a disobedient employee is punished. The word employee came out of his mouth so naturally that I realized that was exactly how he saw me. Not as his mother, not as the owner of the house where he lived for free, but as his personal maid, whom he could scold and threaten whenever he felt like it. But the most alarming thing came next, when Tiffany came down for breakfast, wearing one of her most elegant dresses and high heels, as if she were going to an important meeting. She sat at the table and asked me to serve her eggs Benedict with smoked salmon, a breakfast that costs approximately $30 at high-end restaurants. When I told her I didn't have those ingredients at home, she looked at me with disdain and told me that I would then have to go to the high-end grocery store to buy everything necessary. Terrence immediately backed up his wife, saying that if Tiffany wanted eggs Benedict with salmon, that was exactly what I had to prepare for her. He handed me $80 from his wallet and ordered me to go to the market immediately, because Tiffany had an important appointment at 10 in the morning and needed a good breakfast for energy. It was at that moment that I noticed something very strange. Tiffany was wearing jewelry I had never seen on her before, small diamond earrings and a rose gold bracelet that looked expensive. When I asked her if they were new, she smiled mysteriously and told me Terrence had given them to her last week to celebrate his new job. But I knew Terrence only made $400 a week at his insurance job, and after paying his personal expenses like gas, food, and entertainment, he wouldn't have enough money to buy jewelry that probably cost more than $1,000. Besides, Tiffany had only started working part-time a month ago, and her $200 weekly salary barely covered her transportation and lunch expenses. As I walked to the high-end grocery store with the $80 in my purse, I started putting together strange situations that had been happening in my house for the last few weeks. Last week, I found bills from expensive restaurants in the trash. A dinner at an Italian restaurant that cost $120, another at a steakhouse that cost $110, and a third at a cocktail bar that cost $90. In total, they had spent $320 in a single week on entertainment. I had also noticed that Terrence and Tiffany received online shopping packages almost every day. New clothes, shoes, perfumes, hair accessories for Tiffany, and even an espresso machine that cost $500, which they installed in their room so they wouldn't have to come down to the kitchen in the mornings. When I asked them how they could afford so many purchases, Terrence told me they had received a bonus at their jobs and deserved to treat themselves after so many months of difficulty. But something didn't add up in that explanation. If they had so much extra money for expensive restaurants and unnecessary purchases, why were they still living in my house without paying any rent, utilities, or food? Why hadn't they moved into their own apartment, as they had promised when they arrived? At the grocery store, while buying the smoked salmon, which cost $35 a pound, and the ingredients for the hollandaise sauce, I realized that Terrence and Tiffany had found the perfect situation, living for free in a comfortable house with a free domestic worker who cooked, cleaned, and catered to their every need, while they spent all their income on personal luxuries and entertainment. When I returned home, I heard voices in Terrence's room and decided to listen from the hallway. Tiffany was talking on the phone with someone, and what I heard confirmed my worst suspicions. She was telling the person on the other end of the line that she had found the perfect way to save money for the trip to Europe they wanted to take in December. By living with the mother-in-law, they didn't have to pay rent, utilities, or food, and they also had full 24-hour domestic service. Then I heard Tiffany's cruel laugh as she told her friend how Terrence had managed to convince me that it was my obligation as a mother-in-law to attend to her like a queen. She literally said that I was so naive and manipulative that they could probably stay in my house for years without paying anything while they saved all their money for a down payment on a house of their own in the future. The most painful part was hearing Tiffany say that Terrence had calculated they could save $1,800 a month living with me for free, and that in 2 years, they would have enough money for the down payment on a $200,000 house. Essentially, they were using my home as their personal savings plan, and they were using me as their free domestic employee. When I finished preparing the Eggs Benedict with salmon and took them to Tiffany on an elegant tray, she didn't even thank me. She took the first bite, made a face of disgust, and told me that the hollandaise sauce was too thick and that I had to prepare it again because she couldn't eat it like that. Terrence, who was sitting in bed checking his phone, looked up and told me that I better learn to cook properly because Tiffany had a refined palate and couldn't eat poorly prepared food. He ordered me to go back to the kitchen and make another sauce and not to return this time until it was perfect. I went down to the kitchen with the tray in my trembling hands, feeling the humiliation burn inside me like acid. While preparing the second hollandaise sauce, I understood with total clarity that Terrence and Tiffany had no intention of moving out of my house. They had turned my home into their personal hotel with free, full service, and they had turned me into their private maid. But what they didn't know was that during those 2 hours, it took me to go to the grocery store and prepare their gourmet breakfast. I had made a decision that would change everything. I wasn't going to continue being the silent victim of their selfish and cruel plan. That afternoon, when Terrence and Tiffany left the house for their respective jobs, I took out my phone book and looked up the number for Brenda Hayes, my old neighbor who had moved downtown last year. Brenda had been my confidant during the hardest years after Marcus died, and I knew she was the only person who would tell me the truth without sugarcoating the words. It was time to ask for help and advice because I couldn't face this situation, which had grown larger than my capacity for tolerance, alone. I called Brenda Hayes that afternoon while Terrence and Tiffany were at work, and what she told me on the phone opened my eyes in a way I never imagined possible. Brenda had gone through a similar situation with her older son 5 years ago, and she told me details that made me realize I wasn't the only mother who had been turned into a free domestic worker by her own children. Brenda explained that when adult children return home to live with their mothers after financial failures, they often develop a mentality that they deserve to be treated like hotel guests, especially if the mother is a widow living alone. She told me she had seen cases where children went to the extreme of charging their own mother's rent to live in the houses they themselves had paid for over decades. When I told her about the order to wake up at 5 in the morning to make coffee for Tiffany, Brenda fell silent for several seconds. Then she said something that hit me like a hammer. That this wasn't the behavior of a son going through temporary difficulties, but of a manipulator who had found the perfect way to live without responsibilities while emotionally exploiting his mother. Brenda suggested that I start documenting everything that was happening in my house. She told me to write down every order they gave me, every expense they made me incur, and every sign of disrespect I received in a notebook. She also advised me to start investigating my legal rights as the owner of the property where they lived without paying rent. That night, after serving the dinner, which consisted of $25 a pound roast beef that Terrence had specifically demanded, I started my documentation notebook. I wrote down the date, time, and described every event of the day: the changed alarm, the order for the gourmet breakfast, the $35 salmon purchase, the humiliation of having to redo the hollandaise sauce, and the conversations I had overheard about their savings plans at my expense. The next day, things got considerably worse. Terrence came home from work at 5 in the afternoon with a completely different attitude. He sat in the living room of my house, as if he owned the place, and called me over to talk to him. When I approached, he handed me a handwritten sheet of paper and told me he had prepared a list of my new responsibilities as a housekeeper. The list included things that seemed completely irrational to me. Wake up every day at 5 in the morning to prepare Tiffany's gourmet breakfast. Clean their room every day, including making the bed and hand-washing her underwear. Iron all their clothes on Sundays. Do the grocery shopping every Tuesday and Friday. Buying only high-quality ingredients. Cook 3-course dinners every night and keep the house impeccable 24 hours a day in case of unexpected visitors. But the most outrageous thing on the list was the last point, that I had to ask permission before using the television room after 7 at night, because that was the time Terrence and Tiffany wanted to have privacy to relax after their workdays. When I finished reading the list, I looked up and saw Terrence waiting for my response with an expression of authority that was completely unrecognizable. This wasn't the child I had raised with so much love and sacrifice. This was a stranger who had decided to turn his own mother into his personal employee. I asked him if he was serious, and Terrence answered with a coldness that cut my breath. He told me that he and Tiffany had been very generous with me by allowing me to live in the same house as them, but if I wanted to continue enjoying their company, I had to understand my place and my responsibilities. Tiffany appeared at that moment, coming down the stairs, dressed in a new outfit that had probably cost $200. She approached Terrence, kissed him on the cheek, and looked at me with a smile that seemed sweet, but had something malicious in her eyes. She asked me if I had reviewed the chore list, and when I said yes, she told me she hoped I understood that they needed a certain level of comfort and service to feel comfortable in the house. Then, Tiffany added something that left me speechless. She told me she had talked to her married friends about the situation, and they had all confirmed that it was completely normal for mothers-in-law to take care of their daughters-in-law when they lived in the same house. She said that in well-organized families, each person had their specific function, and my function was to ensure that she and Terrence had everything they needed to be happy and productive. That night, while washing the dishes from the dinner that had cost $60 in special ingredients, I realized that Terrence and Tiffany had carefully planned this conversation. It hadn't been a spontaneous decision or an emotional reaction. They had strategically thought about how to formalize my position as their domestic employee, even creating written rules to ensure I completely understood my new status in my own house. The next day, I began secretly following Brenda's instructions about documenting everything. I noted that I got up at 5 in the morning to prepare Tiffany's breakfast, that I spent $22 on special ingredients, that I cleaned her room for an hour, finding expensive clothes scattered everywhere, and that Terrence scolded me because I hadn't vacuumed under his bed. I also started looking for information online about my rights as the homeowner. I discovered that in our state, when adults live on a property without paying rent and without a formal contract, they are technically considered tenants at will, and the owner can ask them to leave with 30 days prior notice. But the most important thing I discovered was that there were lawyers specializing in cases of family financial abuse, which is exactly what was happening to me. I found the phone number of a law office that offered free consultations for older people in situations of domestic exploitation. That Friday, Tiffany asked me to organize a special dinner for 6 people because she was going to invite her friends over to show off the house. She told me she wanted to serve a 4-course meal with imported wine and calculated the ingredients would cost approximately $150. She handed me the money and told me she expected the food to be at the level of an elegant restaurant. While buying the expensive ingredients Tiffany had demanded, I realized that this dinner wasn't really to impress her friends with the food. It was to impress them with the fact that she had a mother-in-law who served her like a maid. Tiffany wanted to show off her new social status where she didn't have to cook, clean, or worry about household chores because her mother-in-law took care of everything. That night, while serving the elegant dinner that had taken 6 hours to prepare, I heard Tiffany telling her friends how comfortable her new life was. She told them she was very lucky to have married a man whose mother understood the importance of keeping the family happy and together. Tiffany's friends congratulated her on finding such a convenient situation, and one of them commented that she wished her own mother-in-law was so helpful and understanding. After the friends left, Terrence called me into the living room and told me he had been very proud of how I had attended to Tiffany's guests. He said I was finally understanding my role in the family, and that if I kept behaving that way, we could all live in harmony for a long time. That phrase, "for a long time," confirmed what I had already begun to suspect. Terrence and Tiffany had absolutely no intention of moving out of my house. They had found the perfect situation and planned to maintain it indefinitely. That night, after washing all the fine dishes and cleaning the kitchen, which looked like a war zone, I sat on my bed with the documentation notebook and wrote down everything I had observed during dinner. I also noted the comments I had heard and the expressions of satisfaction on Terrence and Tiffany's faces. But the most important thing I wrote was my final decision. The following Monday, I was going to call the lawyer specializing in family financial abuse to schedule a free consultation. I had endured enough humiliation and exploitation in my own home. It was time to seek professional legal help to reclaim my dignity and my home. On Monday morning, after serving the gourmet breakfast, which had already become a humiliating routine, I called the law firm I had found online and scheduled an appointment for that same afternoon. But before I could leave the house, I received a completely unexpected visit that changed everything. Brenda Hayes appeared at my door with a serious expression on her face and a manila folder under her arm. Brenda told me she'd been thinking about our phone conversation all week and had decided to investigate a few things about Terrence and Tiffany on her own. She asked me to sit down in the kitchen because she had very important information to share with me, information I needed to know before making any legal decisions. The first thing Brenda showed me was a series of printed photos she had taken with her phone from her car the previous weekend. The photos clearly showed Terrence and Tiffany leaving a luxury car dealership on Saturday afternoon. In one of the photos, Terrence was signing papers next to a red sports car that definitely cost more than $30,000. Brenda explained that she had decided to follow them discreetly on Saturday to see what they were spending their money on, and what she had discovered had left her completely outraged. Not only had they bought the sports car, but they had then gone to a luxury mall where Terrence had bought Tiffany a new engagement ring that cost $3,000, according to the information Brenda had subtly gotten by asking the jewelry store. But that wasn't all. Brenda had spoken to Denise Williams, an old co-worker from the textile mill who now worked at the bank where Terrence had applied for the car loan. Denise had told her that Terrence had lied on his credit application, claiming he lived in a home he owned, free of a mortgage, and valued at $200,000, and that he had no rent or utility expenses because he was the homeowner. Essentially, Terrence had used my house and my financial stability as collateral to get bank credit, without my knowledge or authorization. He had presented documents where he appeared as the owner of my property and had calculated his disposable income based on the fact that he was living completely free of charge thanks to me. Brenda then showed me a copy of Terrence's credit report that Denise had obtained unofficially. The report showed that over the last 6 months, Terrence had applied for and obtained 4 different credit cards with total limits of $30,000, and he had lied on all the applications about his living situation. Most alarming was that Terrence had used my address as his permanent residence on all official documents, but had declared that he was the owner of the house. This meant that if he couldn't pay his debts, the banks and credit card companies could legally come after my property to recover the money. Next, Brenda handed me a series of receipts she had found in the dumpster in the alley behind my house when she had come to visit me the week before. The receipts showed extravagant purchases Terrence and Tiffany had made in the last 2 months. $500 at a luxury spa for Tiffany, $400 on designer clothes for Terrence, $300 for a romantic dinner to celebrate their wedding anniversary, and even $250 for a professional photo shoot they had taken to update their social media profiles. In total, the receipts added up to more than $1,450 in luxury expenses over the last 2 months, while they lived completely free in my house and forced me to spend my own pension on gourmet food for them. But the most devastating information Brenda had discovered came when she showed me a screenshot of a text message conversation from her niece, Jasmine Evans, who worked at the same insurance company as Terrence. Jasmine had overheard a conversation between Terrence and his coworkers, where Terrence had bragged about finding the perfect way to live like a millionaire on a middle-class salary. In the conversation, Terrence had told his colleagues that he calculated that by living for free with his mother, he could save $1,800 a month, which he used for investments and luxury purchases. He had literally told them that his mother was so manipulable and guilt-ridden that he could probably maintain the situation for years, especially because she felt obligated to take care of him after all the sacrifices she had made for him during his childhood. The cruelest part of that conversation was when Terrence had said that his mother was too old and sentimental to confront him, and that he had learned exactly which emotional buttons to push to keep her obedient and compliant. He had described his own mother as a useful tool for achieving his financial goals. After hearing all this information, I sat in my kitchen chair in complete silence for several minutes. I felt as if I had just woken up from a confusing dream and realized I had been living a real nightmare. Everything I had interpreted as my son's temporary problems was actually an elaborate and malicious plan to exploit me financially and emotionally. Brenda took my hands and told me she understood exactly what I was feeling because she had gone through something similar when she discovered her older son had been stealing money from her bank accounts for 2 years. She told me the hardest thing about these situations is accepting that the children we raised with so much love can become capable of hurting us so deeply. But then Brenda told me something that gave me strength, that I had more power than I thought to change this situation. She explained that as the legal homeowner, I had the absolute right to ask them to leave, regardless of whether they were my family. She said that a mother's love didn't mean accepting abuse, and that protecting myself was not selfishness, but survival. Brenda accompanied me to the appointment with the lawyer that afternoon. Attorney Thomas Bellows received me in his office very kindly and explained my legal options in detail. He confirmed that Terrence had committed bank fraud by using my property as collateral without my authorization, and that I could press criminal charges against him if I wished. But the lawyer also offered a more direct and less traumatic solution, a formal eviction process that would allow me to reclaim my house in 30 days without having to involve the police or create a public scandal. He explained that the process would cost $900 in legal fees and that he would personally handle the delivery of all official notifications. When I returned home that evening, Terrence and Tiffany were in the living room watching television and eating pizza they had ordered without asking me if I wanted anything different for dinner. They treated me as if I were invisible when I entered, and Terrence didn't even look up from the television as I passed by him. That night, after they went to sleep, I sat at my kitchen table with all the documents the lawyer had given me to review. They were papers that would officially initiate the eviction process against my own son, something I had never imagined I would have to do in my life. But as I read the legal documents, I realized I no longer felt sadness or guilt. What I felt was a cold, clear determination. Terrence had made the decision to turn me into his victim, and now I was making the decision to stop being one. The next day, while Terrence and Tiffany were at their jobs spending the money they saved thanks to my free hospitality, I went to the bank and withdrew $900 from my savings account. Then I returned to Attorney Thomas Bellows' office and signed all the necessary papers to initiate the eviction process. The lawyer assured me that the documents would be delivered to Terrence and Tiffany on Friday afternoon and that they would have exactly 30 days to vacate my property. He also explained that during those 30 days, they could not retaliate against me or damage the property because that would constitute an additional crime. That night, I ate dinner alone in my kitchen for the first time in 6 months, and it was the quietest and most satisfying dinner I had had in a long time. The days that followed after signing the eviction papers were the strangest of my life because for the first time in 6 months, I had to act as if nothing had changed while I waited for Friday to arrive for Terrence and Tiffany to receive the legal notice. During those days, I developed an inner calm I had never felt before, as if I had finally found my own voice after years of silence, On Tuesday morning, when Terrence woke me up by yelling from his room that I had forgotten to prepare Tiffany's milk and coffee at 5 in the morning, I simply got up, went to the kitchen, and prepared the breakfast without saying a word. But as I poured the milk and toasted the French bread that Tiffany had specifically demanded, I felt completely different. I was no longer the desperate mother trying to please her ungrateful son. I was a woman who had taken control of her situation and was executing a plan. Tiffany came down for breakfast that morning in a new green dress that probably cost $150 and high heels that I recognized as an expensive brand I had seen in magazines. She sat at my table as if she were a queen waiting to be served and asked me to add organic honey to her Greek yogurt because she had read in a magazine that it was better for digestion. When I served her breakfast on the silver tray that had belonged to my mother, Tiffany tasted the coffee and made a disgusted expression. She told me it was too strong and that I had to prepare a new cup because she couldn't drink bitter coffee. Instead of feeling humiliated as I had other times, I simply smiled and told her, "Of course, I'll immediately prepare another coffee exactly the way you like it." Tiffany looked at me strangely because of my calm attitude, but she didn't say anything. As I prepared the second coffee, I thought about how in 3 days she would receive the legal papers explaining that she would have to prepare her own coffee in another house for the rest of her life. That afternoon, I decided to do something symbolic but important. I called my cousin, Rhonda Clark, who lives in Atlanta, and invited her to come visit me for the weekend. Rhonda was very surprised by my call because she knew Terrence and Tiffany were living with me and didn't understand why I suddenly wanted to have visitors. I told her I wanted to see her and had some important news to share with her. Rhonda agreed to come on Saturday morning and stay until Sunday. When I told Terrence about Rhonda's visit during dinner, he made an obviously annoyed face. He told me he didn't think it was appropriate for me to invite people to the house without consulting him first, because he and Tiffany needed their privacy and didn't want to feel uncomfortable with strangers in their personal space. The phrase, their personal space, seemed so absurd that I almost laughed out loud. Terrence was talking about my own house, as if it were his private property, and was trying to forbid me from inviting my own family. I responded very calmly that Rhonda was my cousin, and that I had the right to welcome her into my house whenever I wanted. Terrence was visibly upset by my response, but he didn't insist on the issue, probably because he didn't want to create a conflict before receiving the legal documents that would change everything. On Wednesday morning, I received a call from attorney Thomas Bellows confirming that everything was ready for the document delivery on Friday at 5 in the afternoon. He explained that he would personally come to my house, accompanied by a court official, to officially deliver the eviction notices to Terrence and Tiffany. He told me I didn't have to be present during the delivery if I didn't want to, but it was important that after that moment, I didn't allow them to pressure or emotionally manipulate me. That night, while cleaning the kitchen, after preparing a $40 dinner that Terrence had demanded to impress a coworker who had come to dinner, I realized I no longer felt resentment toward them. What I felt was a mixture of pity and relief. Pity because my son had become a person I didn't recognize, and relief because I had finally found a way to free myself from a situation that was slowly destroying me. On Thursday morning, I decided to do something symbolic but important. I changed all the locks on my house. I hired a locksmith who charged $150 to install new locks on the front and back doors. When Terrence asked me why I had done that, I told him that thieves had been breaking into houses in the neighborhood, and I wanted to feel safer. Terrence accepted my explanation without suspecting anything, but I knew the new locks were really to ensure that after the eviction, they couldn't enter my house without my permission. That afternoon, while Terrence and Tiffany were at their jobs, I took down all the family photos that had been hanging on the walls for years and stored them in boxes in my room. I didn't want any sentimental objects that Terrence could use to manipulate my emotions or make me feel guilty during the eviction process. I also reviewed all the important documents for the house and made sure they were stored in a safe deposit box I had bought the year before. The house deed, my will, my insurance policies, and all my bank papers were secure where Terrence couldn't find them or take them during the move. On Thursday night, Terrence came home with a strangely cheerful attitude. During dinner, he told me that he and Tiffany had been thinking about staying to live with me permanently because they had discovered that family life was much more comfortable and economical than living alone. He said they had calculated they could save enough money in 2 years to buy their own house, and in the meantime, we could all continue living together in harmony. Tiffany enthusiastically supported Terrence's plan, adding that she had grown very comfortable in my house and genuinely enjoyed having such an attentive and helpful mother-in-law. She told me her friends were very envious of her situation because very few married women were lucky enough to have a mother-in-law who treated them like queens. As I listened to their plans to turn my exploitation into a permanent situation, I maintained a neutral expression and simply nodded when they expected me to respond. Internally, I felt completely calm because I knew that in less than 24 hours, those plans would completely fall apart. After dinner, Terrence handed me a new list of household chores he had prepared to optimize the house's organization. The list included specific times for each activity: deep cleaning on Mondays, grocery shopping on Tuesdays, laundry on Wednesdays, window cleaning on Thursdays, and preparing special meals on Fridays. He had also added new responsibilities like cleaning their cars once a week and keeping the garden perfectly trimmed. I took the list, read it completely, and told Terrence it was very detailed and that I would study it carefully. He smiled, satisfied, thinking he had managed to completely formalize my position as his permanent domestic employee. That night, before going to sleep, I sat on my bed and read the legal documents the lawyer had given me to review before the official delivery. The papers clearly explained that Terrence and Tiffany had 30 days to vacate the property, and that during that time they could not take any objects that were not strictly personal. They also specified that any attempt at intimidation or retaliation against me would constitute an additional violation of the law. I fell asleep that night with a sense of peace I hadn't felt in months. Tomorrow at 5 p.m, the nightmare that had been my life for the last 6 months would officially begin to end. On Friday morning, I woke up early and prepared the last gourmet breakfast I would ever make for Tiffany. As I peeled the fresh fruit and prepared the eggs Benedict that had cost $5 in ingredients, I mentally said goodbye to that humiliating routine that had defined my mornings for so long. At 3 p.m, I received a call from Attorney Bellows, confirming that he and the court official would arrive promptly at 5. He asked me if I felt emotionally prepared for what was about to happen, and I replied that I had never been more prepared for anything in my life. At exactly 5 o'clock on Friday, when the doorbell rang and I saw Attorney Thomas Bellows standing at my door next to the court official, I felt a mixture of nervousness and determination that reminded me of the day I signed my divorce papers from my first marriage 40 years ago. But this time, I wasn't ending a relationship because of lost love, but rescuing my dignity from the hands of my own son. Terrence and Tiffany were in the living room watching television when they heard the doorbell. Tiffany yelled from the sofa, asking who it was with that imperious tone she had adopted when addressing me over the last few months. I replied, "They're visitors for me, and you'll know what it's about in a moment." When I opened the door, Attorney Bellows greeted me professionally and asked if Terrence Clark and Tiffany were in the house. I confirmed that they were, and he asked me to call them to the door because he had official documents to deliver to them personally. Terrence appeared first, walking with that casual attitude he had when he thought everything was under his control. When he saw the lawyer and the court official, his expression changed immediately. He approached the door with a confused look and asked me what was going on. I simply told him, "These people have something important to tell you." Attorney Bellows formally introduced himself and handed Terrence the manila envelope with the eviction documents. He explained that Terrence had 30 calendar days to vacate the property, along with all his belongings, and that if he did not comply voluntarily with the order, a forced eviction would proceed, which would include police intervention. Terrence took the envelope with trembling hands and opened it immediately. As he read the documents, his face went from confusion to shock, and then to a fury I had never seen on him in my entire life. He looked up at me and shouted, "Are you responsible for this?" I replied very calmly, "Yes, I hired the attorney to reclaim my house." At that moment, Tiffany came running from the living room, asking what was happening and why Terrence was yelling. When Terrence showed her the legal papers, Tiffany became completely hysterical. She started screaming that this had to be a mistake, that I couldn't kick them out of the house because they were family, and that surely someone had made a legal error. The court official patiently explained to Tiffany that there was no mistake, that the documents had been correctly processed by the court system, and that as tenants at will, without a lease or legal rights to the property, they were required to comply with the eviction order. Terrence looked at me with an expression that mixed disbelief and betrayal. He asked me, "How could you do this to your own son after everything he's done for you?" The irony of that question was so absurd that I almost laughed. I replied, "Precisely because you are my son, I expected you to treat me with respect in my own house, and you chose to turn me into your free domestic employee." Tiffany interrupted, screaming that I was an ungrateful old woman, that they had been very generous by keeping me company in my empty house, and that without them, I would be completely alone and depressed. She told me I should be thankful. They had decided to stay with me instead of moving me to a nursing home where I belong. That threat about the nursing home confirmed that Brenda had been right about Terrence and Tiffany's long-term intentions. They not only wanted to exploit me as a domestic employee, but they had also considered the possibility of getting rid of me completely when I was no longer useful to them. Terrence tried to change strategy and adopt a more emotional tone. He told me he understood they might have made some mistakes in living together, but those problems could be resolved by talking like a civilized family. He pleaded with me to cancel the legal process and give them another chance to prove they could live together in harmony. I replied that they had already had 6 months of opportunities and had chosen to turn every day into a humiliation for me. I told him, "A son who forces his 71-year-old mother to wake up at 5 in the morning to serve breakfast in bed to his wife does not deserve another opportunity." Attorney Bellows explained that they had the right to seek legal counsel if they wanted to dispute the order, but that as occupants without contractual rights to the property, they had very few legal options available. He also reminded them that any damage to the property during the next 30 days would constitute an additional criminal offense. After the lawyer and the official left, Terrence and Tiffany remained standing in the living room with the documents in their hands, as if they couldn't fully process what had happened. For several minutes, they said nothing, simply staring at each other with expressions of shock and confusion. Finally, Terrence broke the silence. He told me I had made the biggest mistake of my life, that after this, he would never forgive me, and that when I was old and sick, I couldn't count on him for anything. He threatened that I would never see my future grandchildren, and that he would tell the entire family how cruel and selfish I had been to him. Tiffany added that I would regret this decision when I realized how alone I would be without them. She said I had destroyed my own family for being a bitter old woman who didn't know how to appreciate the people who loved her. Their threats and insults hurt me, but they didn't make me doubt my decision. I responded that I preferred to be alone and in peace than accompanied and humiliated. I told them that a son who threatens his mother with taking away her grandchildren as punishment for defending her dignity was demonstrating exactly why I had made the right decision. That night, Terrence and Tiffany locked themselves in their room and talked in low voices for hours. Occasionally, I heard shouting and arguments, but I couldn't make out the specific words. At 11 at night, Terrence came out of the room and came to the kitchen where I was reading a book. He sat down across from me and adopted a completely different attitude. With a soft, controlled voice, he told me he had been thinking about the whole situation and realized that perhaps they had been too demanding of me. He apologized for having been insensitive to my feelings and promised that if I canceled the eviction, they would completely change their behavior. Terrence proposed a new arrangement where they would pay $600 a month in rent, take care of their own meals and cleaning, and treat me with the respect I deserved as his mother and the homeowner. He said they had learned a very important lesson about gratitude and family consideration. I told him I appreciated his apologies, but it was already too late for negotiations. I explained that their behavior over the last 6 months had shown me who he really was, and that last-minute apologies couldn't erase months of deliberate humiliation. Terrence insisted for over an hour, alternating between emotional pleas and promises of radical change. He reminded me of all the happy moments of his childhood, talked about the importance of keeping the family together, and assured me that Tiffany was also willing to apologize and completely change her attitude. But I remained firm in my decision. I told him that the 30 days the law had given him were more than enough to find a new place to live, and that I hoped he would use that time productively instead of trying to manipulate me into changing my mind. When Terrence realized he wouldn't get me to change my decision, his mask of repentance completely dropped. He told me that I had become a selfish, heartless woman, that I had lost love for my own son, and that he would do everything possible to ensure I paid the consequences for my cruelty. I replied that the only consequences that mattered to me were recovering my peace and my dignity in my own house. I told him he had 30 days to leave, and that after that, he could live his life however he wanted, but away from me. I went to sleep that night feeling a mixture of sadness and relief. Sadness because the relationship with my son had reached this point of total breakdown, but relief because I had finally taken control of my own life. The following days after the delivery of the legal documents were like living in a cold war zone inside my own house. Terrence and Tiffany oscillated between desperate attempts at emotional manipulation and direct attacks designed to make me feel guilty and change my decision. But for the first time in 6 months, I was in control of the situation, and they knew it. On Saturday morning, Tiffany appeared in the kitchen at 5:30 with eyes red from crying all night. She sat down across from me while I prepared my coffee and began to speak to me in a broken voice that she had clearly rehearsed. She told me she had been thinking about the whole situation and realized that maybe she had been too demanding of me during the last few months. Tiffany told me an elaborate story about her difficult childhood, where her own mother-in-law had mistreated her when she married her first husband, and that was why she had developed a defensive attitude toward maternal figures. She begged for my forgiveness with tears in her eyes, saying that I had been like the mother she never had, and that the idea of losing me was destroying her emotionally. Then Tiffany offered me a deal she had obviously planned carefully. She proposed that if I canceled the eviction, she would take care of all the household chores while I rested and enjoyed my retirement like a queen. She told me she had been blinded by the comfort of being waited on, but now understood that my role should be that of the respected matriarch of the family, not the employee. While listening to her carefully prepared performance, I maintained a neutral expression and let her finish her entire speech. When she finished, I responded very calmly that I appreciated her apologies, but I had already made a final decision about my life and my home. I told her she had 26 days remaining to find a new place to live, and suggested she use that time productively. Tiffany's mask of repentance immediately collapsed. She stood up from the table with a fury she no longer tried to hide, and yelled that I was a spiteful old woman who didn't know how to forgive. She said I had wasted the opportunity to have a united family, and that when I was alone and abandoned, I could only blame myself. That afternoon, Terrence tried a different strategy. He came home with a $75 bottle of wine and flowers that probably cost $50. He told me he wanted to cook a special dinner for the three of us, as a way to celebrate the good times we had shared as a family. He asked me to sit in the living room while he and Tiffany prepared a meal that would demonstrate how much they valued me. For 2 hours, Terrence and Tiffany worked in the kitchen, preparing an elaborate dinner that included imported meat, organic vegetables, and a dessert they had bought at an expensive bakery. The dinner had probably cost them more than $175, money they had spent specifically to impress me and make me change my mind. When they served me dinner on my best porcelain china, Terrence made an emotional toast where he spoke about the importance of family and forgiveness. He told me he had reflected deeply on his mistakes and was willing to make any sacrifice necessary to repair our relationship. He assured me that he had learned to value everything I had done for him during his life and that he would never disrespect me again. Tiffany added that she had also learned a valuable lesson about gratitude and respect for elders. She promised me that if I gave them another chance, she would become the most attentive and helpful daughter-in-law I could imagine. She told me she had spoken with her friends about the situation, and they had all explained that mothers-in-law deserved to be treated like queens in their own homes. While eating the expensive dinner they had prepared as an emotional bribe, I thanked them for the effort and told them the food was delicious, but I also confirmed that my decision remained the same and that no special dinner would change the fact that they had to leave my house in 25 days. Terrence's frustration was evident when he realized his reconciliation strategy hadn't worked. He abruptly got up from the table and asked me, "What exactly do you want from us?" I replied simply that I wanted them to respect my decision and leave my house when the legal deadline ended. On Sunday morning, my cousin Rhonda arrived as we had planned. When she saw the obvious tension in the house and the long faces of Terrence and Tiffany, she immediately understood that something important had happened. During lunch, while Terrence and Tiffany were in their room talking in low voices, I told Rhonda the whole story of the last 6 months and the decisions I had made. Rhonda listened without interrupting, and when I finished my story, she took my hands and told me she was very proud of me for finding the courage to defend myself. She told me she had gone through a similar situation with her younger daughter 3 years ago, and that making difficult decisions about family was sometimes the only way to preserve personal dignity. That afternoon, Terrence tried to involve Rhonda in his manipulation efforts. He asked her to talk to me to make me understand how important it was to keep the family together, especially considering that I was an older woman who needed the support of her children. Terrence told Rhonda that he had made some minor mistakes, but the eviction was an exaggerated reaction that would destroy our relationship forever. Rhonda patiently listened to Terrence's arguments, but then she responded that as my cousin, she had observed for years how Estelle had sacrificed everything for his well-being. She told him that an adult son who turns his mother into a free domestic employee doesn't deserve understanding or second chances, and that he should be grateful that Estelle had given him 30 days instead of kicking him out immediately. On Monday morning, Terrence completely changed his strategy and adopted a victim attitude. During breakfast, he told me he had spoken with some relatives about the situation and that they were all very disappointed in my behavior. He told me that his Uncle Robert had said that modern mothers had become too selfish and that in the old days, families stayed together regardless of the difficulties. Then Terrence informed me that he had called my sister, who lives in another state, to tell her what was happening. According to him, my sister was very worried about my mental stability and had suggested that perhaps I needed psychological help to deal with the loneliness of widowhood. Terrence told me that several relatives were considering coming to visit me to stage a family intervention. That manipulation, using other relatives, bothered me more than all the previous ones because Terrence was trying to create a narrative where I was the irrational villain and he was the innocent victim. I told him very clearly that he could call whoever he wanted, but no relative was going to change my decision because none of them had lived in my house for the last 6 months being treated like a domestic employee. On Tuesday, Terrence adopted a strategy of financial intimidation. He told me he had been researching the cost of living for a single woman my age and that I had no idea how expensive life had become. He explained that my $1,000 monthly pension was not enough to maintain a large house, especially considering the costs of utilities, maintenance, security, and food. Terrence presented me with a detailed list of monthly expenses that, according to him, I would have to face alone. $300 for utilities, $200 for food, $100 for house maintenance, and various other expenses totaling more than $800 a month. He told me that mathematically it was impossible for me to live alone without financial help. Then he offered me a proposal that he presented as an economically beneficial solution for everyone. If I canceled the eviction, he and Tiffany would pay $600 a month in rent, take care of all utility expenses, and share the costs of food and maintenance. He told me that from a financial point of view, it was a completely irrational decision to kick them out when they were willing to contribute financially. I replied that I had lived alone for 3 years after my husband's death and had managed all the household expenses perfectly well with my pension and my savings. I told him that the difference between living alone and living with them was not economic, but emotional, and that I preferred to eat beans every day in peace than to eat expensive meat in an environment of constant humiliation. On Wednesday night, Tiffany made her last desperate attempt at manipulation. She came to my room at 11 at night with an exaggerated look of sadness and told me she had something very important to confess. She sat on the edge of my bed and told me she was 6 weeks pregnant and had been waiting for the perfect moment to give me the news. Tiffany told me she had planned to announce the pregnancy during a special dinner the following month because she wanted me to be the first to know I was going to be a grandmother. With tears in her eyes, Tiffany begged me to reconsider the eviction for the sake of the baby. She said she couldn't bear the idea of raising her child away from his grandmother, and that all children deserve to have a close relationship with their grandparents. She promised me that if I canceled the legal process, she would ensure I had a central role in the baby's life. I listened to her entire emotional confession without interrupting, but when she finished, I told her I regretted that she had decided to use a pregnancy as a tool for manipulation. I explained that if she was truly pregnant, that was an additional reason for her and Terrence to find their own home where they could raise their child with independence and responsibility. I told her that a child needed parents who knew how to live autonomously, not parents who depended on emotionally exploiting a grandmother to maintain their lifestyle. I assured her that if the baby existed, I would be happy to meet and love him, but that would happen in my house during scheduled visits, not as a result of emotional blackmail. Tiffany left my room that night with an expression of total defeat, finally understanding that none of her strategies were going to work. On Thursday morning, Terrence and Tiffany officially began packing their belongings. I heard them moving around the house, gathering their things with a frantic and resentful energy. Occasionally, I heard sarcastic comments about how unfair and cruel I had been to them, but they no longer tried to talk directly to me. While they packed, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of coffee, and for the first time in 6 months, I felt completely at peace in my own home. The day Terrence and Tiffany finally left my house was a Saturday in March, exactly 30 days after they received the legal documents. During those last 4 weeks, they had packed their belongings with deliberate slowness, as if they were waiting until the last moment for me to change my mind. But when the final day arrived, they understood that my decision was definitive and irreversible. That morning, I woke up at 6. Not because someone had ordered me to, but because I wanted to see the sunrise from my window without the pressure of having to prepare gourmet breakfast for people who didn't respect me. I made my own coffee in my own kitchen, sat at my favorite table, and for the first time in 6 months, enjoyed the complete silence of my home. At 9 in the morning, Terrence and Tiffany began loading their belongings into the red sports car they had bought with the money they saved living for free in my house. They had accumulated so much stuff that they had to make 3 different trips, carrying boxes, suitcases, appliances, and all the expensive clothes they had bought during the months they didn't pay rent or utilities. While they loaded this car, I remained seated in my living room reading a book without offering to help or say an emotional goodbye. They had had 30 days to prepare for this moment, and I had had 30 days to get used to the idea that my relationship with Terrence had changed forever. When Terrence came to return the house keys to me, he looked at me with a mixture of resentment and sadness that no longer affected me emotionally. He told me he hoped I was happy with my decision, because from now on, I would have all the loneliness in the world to reflect on what I had lost. He assured me he would never forgive me for choosing my personal comfort over the well-being of the family. I replied that I was completely at peace with my decision and that I wished him the best in his new independent life. I told him that the doors of my house would always be open for him to visit me as my son, but they would never again be open for him to treat me as his domestic employee. Tiffany then approached with the room keys and also handed me a handwritten list of all the expenses that, according to her, I owed them for improvements they had made to the house. The list included the $500 espresso machine they had installed in their room, the new curtains they had bought for the living room, and even the cost of the paint they had used to touch up some walls. I took the list, read it completely, and handed it back to her, telling her that all those improvements had been made without my authorization and for their own benefit. Therefore, I had no obligation to reimburse them for anything. I explained that when someone lives for free in a house for 6 months, any money they spend on improvements should be considered a minimal contribution rather than a reimbursable investment. After handing over the keys, Terrence and Tiffany left without saying goodbye. I watched them drive away from my living room window, and the only thing I felt was a deep relief and a sense of freedom I hadn't experienced in a long time. In the following weeks, my life changed completely. I no longer had to wake up at 5 in the morning to serve gourmet breakfasts. I no longer had to spend my pension on expensive food for ungrateful people. I no longer had to clean other people's rooms or wash clothes that weren't mine. For the first time in 6 months, my time belonged entirely to me. I began to rediscover activities I had abandoned during the months of domestic exploitation. I went back to reading novels in the afternoons, resumed my passion for gardening, and even started taking painting classes at the neighborhood community center. With the money I no longer spent on gourmet food for Terrence and Tiffany, I could afford small personal luxuries like magazines, new books, and art supplies. I also started receiving visits from friends and family who had avoided coming to my house during the months Terrence and Tiffany lived with me. Brenda came for coffee every Wednesday. My cousin Rhonda visited me every 2 weeks, and even my neighbor Denise Williams started stopping by in the afternoons to chat in the garden. A month after the eviction, I received a call from Terrence. He told me he and Tiffany had rented a small apartment that cost them $1,200 a month and were having financial difficulties paying the rent, utilities, and food. He asked me for a $1,000 loan to help them with the moving expenses in their new home. I replied that I regretted their financial difficulties, but it was no longer my financial responsibility to solve their adult problems. I suggested that he reduce his spending on entertainment and unnecessary purchases and learn to live within his real means. I told him that was an important lesson he should have learned a long time ago. Terrence was upset by my refusal and told me I had completely changed, that I had become a cold and insensitive woman. I replied that I hadn't changed. I had simply stopped allowing myself to be emotionally exploited. I explained that a mother's love did not mean constantly rescuing an adult child from the consequences of his own irresponsible decisions. 2 months after the eviction, Tiffany called me to tell me she was truly pregnant and wanted me to be present in the baby's life as a grandmother. She invited me to lunch at a restaurant to talk about how we could rebuild our family relationship now that there was a grandson involved. I accepted the invitation because I genuinely wanted to meet my future grandson, but I made my conditions very clear. I told her I would be happy to be a loving grandmother, but that would happen on my terms and in my house during scheduled visits. I explained that I would not become a free babysitter or a domestic employee again, no matter how many grandchildren they had. Tiffany accepted my conditions because she needed financial and emotional support during the pregnancy, but I could see in her eyes that she hadn't truly learned the lesson. She still thought she could eventually manipulate me back into the previous situation, using the baby as an emotional tool. 6 months after reclaiming my house, my life had found a balance and peace I hadn't felt in years. I had learned that setting clear boundaries was not cruelty, but emotional survival. I had discovered that chosen solitude was infinitely better than toxic company, and I had understood that true love for children sometimes requires letting them face the consequences of their actions. Now, when I wake up every morning in my own house, at the time I decide to prepare the breakfast I want to eat, I feel grateful for having found the courage to defend myself. I am no longer anyone's free domestic employee. I am Estelle Clark, a 71-year-old woman who recovered her dignity and her home. To all the women who are listening to me and who may be going through similar situations, I want to tell you that it's never too late to stand up for yourself, that a mother's love doesn't mean accepting abuse, and that we deserve respect in our own homes, no matter how old we are. If my story helped you reflect on your own lives, you would make me very happy by leaving a comment telling me what you think. And if you know any woman who needs to hear these words, please share this video so it reaches more people who may need to find their own voice. Thank you for joining me in this story, and remember that we are never too old to start a new life. 2 years have passed since Terrence and Tiffany left my house, and as I write these lines at my kitchen table, surrounded by the warm silence of my home, I realize that difficult decision became the greatest gift I have ever given myself. Today is my 73rd birthday, and for the first time in decades, I am celebrating it exactly how I want, with a cup of freshly brewed coffee, a piece of cake I bought just for myself, and the deep satisfaction of knowing that every moment of my day belongs entirely to me. The story of my grandson, Ezra, began 4 months after the eviction, when Tiffany gave birth to a beautiful baby who came into the world with the curious eyes of his grandfather, Marcus. From the beginning, I set clear rules about my participation as a grandmother: visits on Sunday afternoons for 2 hours, always at my house, and never as an emergency babysitter or free caregiver. Terrence and Tiffany tried several times to convince me to look after the baby while they worked, offering me barely $150 a week for 40 hours of childcare, but I held my boundaries firm. The first year was financially difficult for them. Terrence lost his job at the insurance company because he was constantly late, exhausted by sleepless nights with the baby and the financial pressure of maintaining an apartment. Tiffany had to return to work 2 months after giving birth, making barely $200 a week at a cheap hair studio. Between the two of them, they barely managed $1,400 a month, which was not enough for the $1,200 rent, $300 in utilities, $600 for food, and $400 for baby expenses. Every time they called me asking for financial help, I responded with practical suggestions: move to a cheaper apartment, look for additional part-time jobs, sell the sports car they were still paying $700 a month for, or cut unnecessary expenses like cable television and restaurant meals. But instead of making sacrifices, they preferred to keep asking for financial rescues that I was no longer willing to provide. The most surprising transformation happened during the second year. Terrence finally got a stable job at a construction company where he made $1,000 a week, but only after the bank threatened to repossess the sports car due to late payments. Tiffany increased her income to $300 a week, working at a more established salon. And together, they began to live within their real means for the first time in their adult lives. Little by little, Terrence began to treat me with a respect he hadn't shown in years. During our Sunday visits, he arrived punctually. He thanked me for my time with Ezra and even started asking me about my life and my activities. He never apologized directly for the months of domestic exploitation, but his behavior clearly changed. Tiffany, on the other hand, maintained a forced courtesy that made it clear she still blamed me for their financial difficulties. My personal life flourished in ways I hadn't anticipated. With the financial freedom of not supporting 2 parasitic adults, I could afford small luxuries that had been out of my reach for years. I joined a gym for older adults that cost $50 a month, where I made wonderful friends like Joanna Munoz, a 75-year-old widow who became my workout partner and confidant. I also resumed my passion for sewing, buying a new $500 machine that allows me to create my own dresses and repair clothes for my neighbors in exchange for small amounts of money. This extra income, although modest, gives me a sense of economic independence that I had lost during the years of excessive spending supporting Terrence. My garden became my favorite refuge. I invested $300 in new plants, gardening tools, and vegetable seeds that now provide me with fresh tomatoes, lettuce, and herbs all year round. The mornings I used to spend preparing gourmet breakfasts for ungrateful people, I now spend watering my plants and enjoying the birdsong from the trees Marcus and I planted. My relationship with Brenda deepened into a genuine friendship based on shared experiences and mutual respect. We meet every Wednesday for lunch and talk about our lives without the pressure of solving the problems of adult, irresponsible children. Brenda told me that her older son, after being kicked out of her house 5 years ago, now has a thriving appliance repair business and visits her regularly with respect and gratitude. One of the most gratifying surprises of the last year was reconnecting with relatives I had lost touch with during the chaotic years of constantly rescuing Terrence from his financial problems. My cousin Rhonda Clark, who lives in Atlanta, started visiting me every 3 months, and we discovered we share a passion for history books and mystery novels. During her visits, we explore local museums, attend lectures at the library, and enjoy intellectual conversations that remind me how intelligent and educated I am when I am not being treated as a domestic employee. The most liberating aspect of my new life is managing my money. My $1,000 monthly pension, which once seemed insufficient when supporting 3 people, now allows me to live comfortably and even save $100 every month. I have accumulated $1,500 in a savings account that I use for medical emergencies and occasional small trips. Last year, I was able to afford a 4-day trip to the mountains with a group of older women from the community center. The trip cost $450, including transportation, hotel, and meals. It was the first time in decades I had spent money on my own entertainment without feeling guilty for not saving to rescue Terrence from his next financial crisis. My physical and mental health improved remarkably during these 2 years. The chronic stress of living in an emotionally exploitative environment had affected my blood pressure and sleep pattern. Now I sleep 8 full hours every night. My blood pressure normalized, and I have energy for activities I had abandoned. The gym exercises helped me maintain my mobility and strength, and the yoga classes taught me relaxation techniques that I use when I occasionally feel anxiety about the future. The relationship with my grandson Ezra developed naturally and lovingly within the boundaries I set. Every Sunday afternoon, he arrives at my house with bright eyes and smiles that fill my heart with genuine joy. We have created special rituals. We read stories in my favorite rocking chair. We play with building blocks on the living room rug. And he helps me water the garden plants with a small watering can I bought specifically for him. Most importantly, Ezra knows me as his loving grandmother, but not as his emergency caregiver. When Terrence and Tiffany have social commitments or work issues, they look for paid sitters instead of pressuring me to change my plans. This healthy dynamic allows me to enjoy my grandson without the resentment I would have developed if they had turned me into a free caregiver. 6 months ago, Terrence surprised me with a conversation I never expected. During one of our Sunday visits, after Ezra fell asleep in my arms, Terrence told me he had been reflecting on the months he lived in my house and finally understood why I had made the decision to kick him out. He said that facing his own responsibilities as a father and husband, he had realized how unfair he had been to me during those 6 months. It wasn't exactly a full apology, but it was an acknowledgement that my decision had been correct and necessary. He told me that he and Tiffany had learned to value their economic independence and were proud to be able to support their family without depending on anyone else. He also thanked me for not giving in to his manipulations, because that had forced them to mature into responsible adults. Tiffany, although less expressive in her feelings, also began to treat me with a genuine cordiality that contrasts dramatically with the imperious attitude she had when she lived in my house. During Sunday visits, she and I have found conversation topics that go beyond Ezra. We talk about our jobs, our reading, and even exchange cooking recipes. The deepest aspect of my personal transformation has been rediscovering my own identity beyond the role of the self-sacrificing mother. For decades, I defined my personal worth in terms of how much I could give and sacrifice for my son. But now I understand that my emotional well-being and personal dignity are equally important. I have learned that setting boundaries is not selfishness, but self-respect, and that saying no to irrational demands is a form of self-love. Some nights, when I sit on my back porch watching the stars, I reflect on the woman I was 2 years ago compared to the woman I am now. The Estelle of before lived in a constant state of anxiety, trying to please people who would never be satisfied no matter how much she sacrificed. The Estelle of now lives with a deep serenity, knowing that every decision I make is based on my own well-being and values. If I could talk to other women going through similar situations, I would tell them that it is never too late to take back control of their lives, that love for children does not require self-annihilation, and that teaching healthy boundaries is one of the best gifts we can give our families. I would tell them that chosen solitude is infinitely superior to toxic company, and that we deserve respect in our own homes no matter our age. Tomorrow I will start my day as always, waking up when my body is ready, preparing the breakfast I want to eat, and planning activities that bring me joy. Ezra will come on Sunday as always, and we will enjoy our time together on my terms. Terrence and Tiffany will continue building their independent life, and I will continue to be a loving but non-exploitable part of their lives. This is my story of personal liberation, and I hope it inspires other women to find their own voice and worth. I'm really glad you're here and that I could share my story with you. If you liked it, show me by liking the video and subscribing to my channel. Let's see how many of us there are. Write in the comments which city you're watching from and what time it is. I'm so curious to know where all you wonderful people are tuning in from. If you want to support me a little extra, you can also send a small donation. I share new life stories for you every single day, and now 2 of my most popular stories will pop up on the screen so you can choose what to watch next.